My name is Savannah, 33 years old, and for 3 years I was a prisoner inside my own body. When my grandfather accidentally noticed the horrific bruises covering my arms, I burst into tears and confessed the unimaginable truth about what my stepmother had been doing to me in the dark. He did not yell or cause a scene. He simply frowned, clenched his fists, and told me to pack my things, because tomorrow we were going to play her game by his rules. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rely on a true protector to escape a toxic family. The crystal chandeliers of the Boston Harbor Hotel blinded me. I gripped the edge of the linen-draped table, digging my fingernails into the wood just to stop the room from spinning. Across the grand ballroom, my stepmother Patricia was holding court. She was accepting praise and raising champagne glasses for her philanthropic efforts in mental health awareness. The irony was so thick it made me nauseous. I was the founder and CEO of a multi-million-dollar luxury estate liquidation firm, a woman who used to negotiate high-stakes property deals before breakfast. But right now, standing in this crowded ballroom, I could barely remember my own address. The chemical fog in my brain was suffocating. It was the direct result of the mandatory daily wellness infusions Patricia insisted I needed to treat my supposed severe depression. Brittany, my 28-year-old stepsister, marched toward me through the crowd. She wore a smug, predatory smile and held a full glass of Cabernet. Behind her walked her husband Terrence, a quiet African-American man who always kept his eyes fixed on the floor. My family constantly belittled Terrence, treating him like a broke opportunist who had married into wealth, and he endured their racist microaggressions in total silence. I always felt a pang of pity for him, but tonight I could barely keep my own eyes open. Brittany stopped right in front of me. With a flick of her wrist, she intentionally stumbled. The dark red wine splashed directly across the bodice of my white silk gown, soaking through to my skin. "God, you are so clumsy since your mental breakdown," Savannah Brittany sneered, her voice carrying loudly enough for nearby guests to turn and stare. "You look like a zombie. Go hide in the bathroom before you embarrass this family further. It does not matter anyway. Your permanent conservatorship hearing is next week. Let Patricia and me handle the adult business from now on." I did not have the energy to fight back. The sedative coursing through my veins made my tongue feel like lead. I turned and fled the ballroom, the cold marble of the hallway echoing under my unsteady heels. I locked myself inside the handicap stall of the luxury restroom. I grabbed a fistful of rough paper towels, desperately scrubbing at the crimson stain on my dress, but my hands were shaking violently, my vision blurred. I leaned against the sink, fighting the urge to vomit, terrified that Patricia would walk through the door at any second to drag me back out for public display. The main restroom door clicked shut, and the heavy deadbolt turned. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Winston, my grandfather. At 78 years old, Winston was a ruthless, self-made billionaire shipping magnate who intimidated absolutely everyone, including Patricia. He had just flown in from Europe, deliberately bypassing the main gala to find me. He took off his custom-tailored suit jacket and stepped toward me, his sharp eyes taking in my disheveled, trembling state. "Put this on," he ordered, his voice a low, commanding rumble. I reached out to take the jacket. As I pulled my arm through the heavy fabric, the wet silk of my ruined gown snagged against my skin. I pulled too hard, and the delicate silk sleeve tore open, exposing my left arm from the shoulder down to the wrist. Winston froze. The air in the bathroom seemed to instantly vanish. He dropped the jacket and grabbed my wrist, pushing the torn silk even higher. Dark purple, yellow, and black bruises painted my skin in a horrifying mosaic. Puncture wounds, blown veins, and inflamed track marks dotted the inside of my elbow. They were the undeniable physical evidence of a medical nightmare I had been hiding under long sleeves for years. Savannah Winston said, his voice stripped of its usual iron control. "What is this?" The dam broke. 3 years of pure terror, gaslighting, and chemical subjugation poured out of me in a wave of hysterical sobs. "She is not giving me vitamins?" "Grandpa," I cried, collapsing against his chest as my legs finally gave out. "She is pumping me full of heavy, unprescribed antipsychotics. She uses the nurses from her private clinic to drug me every single morning. She is intentionally destroying my brain so she can present fake medical records to the judge next week. She wants full legal control over my body so she can liquidate my company and steal everything I built. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for him to call me delusional. I braced myself for him to say that Patricia was a respected medical director who knew what was best for my mental health just like everyone else did. But Winston did not say any of that. He stared at my bruised, battered arms. He looked at my terrified, tear-stained face. He did not yell. He did not storm out of the bathroom to cause a scene in the ballroom. The lethal, calculating calm that settled over his weathered features was far more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. Winston carefully buttoned his suit jacket around my shoulders, hiding the evidence from the world. He pulled me close, his grip unyielding and protective. "Dry your tears right now," he whispered fiercely into my ear. "You will walk out of this bathroom, and you will smile at those vultures. Tonight you pack your bags in silence. You are staying at my estate. Tomorrow we play her game, but we are going to play it strictly by my rules." I walked out of that handicap stall a different woman. I kept my shoulders slumped and my eyes vacant, playing the perfect medicated victim for the rest of the gala. But beneath the silk and the stains, my grandfather had ignited a war. The next morning, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up the winding driveway of Patricia's estate. Winston stepped out. Patricia was waiting by the grand mahogany doors, wearing her designer morning robe, a practiced smile plastered on her face. She stepped forward to greet him, ready to offer false sympathies about my declining mental state. Before she could utter a single syllable, Winston clutched his chest. He staggered forward, leaning heavily against the marble pillar of the entryway. He gasped for air, his face contorting in simulated agony. Patricia rushed forward, her eyes wide with a mix of alarm and unmistakable greed. Winston waved off her frantic offers to call an ambulance. He claimed his European cardiologists had warned him about these severe stress-induced palpitations and prescribed immediate prolonged bed rest. He declared he was moving into the East Guest Wing indefinitely. He insisted he needed to be close to his family, especially his ailing granddaughter, during his recovery. I watched from the top of the stairs, keeping my expression entirely blank. Patricia swallowed the bait whole. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. Having a billionaire patriarch resting under her roof meant she could isolate him, charm him, and eventually manipulate his vast fortune just as easily as she was stealing mine. She immediately ordered the household staff to prepare the finest suite and promised Winston she would oversee his dietary and medical needs personally. She had no idea she had just invited a Trojan horse into her fortress. Within 24 hours, Winston mobilized his unparalleled resources. He completely bypassed Patricia's sophisticated home security system by bringing in a private, uncorrupted phlebotomist. He disguised the medical professional as an elite Italian tailor arriving to take measurements for his custom suits. While Patricia was occupied in her home office with a conference call for her luxury rehab clinics, the phlebotomist slipped into my bedroom and drew 3 vials of my blood. The rush lab results came back by midnight. Winston sat on the edge of my bed, his face carved from stone as he read the secure email on his tablet. Patricia was not giving me vitamins or hydration therapy. For 3 years, my daily intravenous drips had been heavily laced with unprescribed high doses of heavy antipsychotics and powerful sedatives. It was a chemical cocktail designed to tranquilize a large animal, specifically formulated to induce severe memory loss, physical tremors, and symptoms identical to early-onset dementia. Patricia was methodically erasing my brain to present a flawless, medically documented case for my permanent conservatorship. Winston did not waste a single second. He initiated a highly dangerous game of chemical roulette right under my stepmother's nose. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Patricia's private clinic nurse arrived to hang my daily IV bag. Winston used his fake heart condition to his absolute advantage. He would call out for the nurse from the hallway, demanding his blood pressure be checked, or complaining of a sudden shooting pain, forcing her to step out of my room for just 2 minutes. That was all the time he needed. With military precision, Winston swapped the heavily drugged IV bag with an identical bag of pure saline he kept hidden in his hollowed-out luggage. By day 3, the chemical fog began to lift. The physical withdrawal was agonizing. My head throbbed, my muscles ached, and cold sweats drenched my sheets every night. But underneath the physical pain, my mind was sharpening. The thick, suffocating cloud that had suppressed my thoughts evaporated. I remembered everything. I remembered the ruthless CEO I used to be. I remembered every commercial real estate deal I had ever closed. Most importantly, I remembered the intense burning hatred I had for the woman who had stolen my life. But survival required absolute discipline. I could not show a single ounce of recovery. If Patricia suspected I was regaining my cognitive function before the court hearing, she would force me into an inpatient facility immediately. So I played the part. I slurred my words. I let my hands tremble when I held a water glass. I stared blankly at the walls whenever she or my stepsister Brittany entered the room. Brittany was the worst of them all. Vain, greedy, and entirely incompetent, she treated my illness like an inconvenient chore. On Thursday evening, it was her turn to administer my oral nighttime medication. She stormed into my bedroom smelling heavily of expensive perfume and alcohol, holding a small paper cup with a heavy blue pill. "Open up and swallow it," Savannah Brittany barked, checking her diamond watch. "I have a dinner reservation in 30 minutes, and I am not going to be late because you cannot swallow properly. Hurry up." I kept my hands shaking as I reached for the cup. I placed the pill on my tongue, took a sip of water, and swallowed loudly. I opened my mouth to show her it was gone. Satisfied, Brittany rolled her eyes, turned on her heel, and marched out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The second the latch clicked, I spat the blue pill into the palm of my hand. I had hidden it perfectly under my tongue. I waited 2 hours until the house was entirely silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. I crept out of my bedroom, moving silently down the grand staircase in my bare feet. I needed to dispose of the pill where it would never be found. I slipped into the massive dark kitchen, navigating by the moonlight filtering through the French doors. I approached the sink, dropped the heavy blue pill down the drain, and flipped the switch for the garbage disposal. The grinding noise echoed loudly for 2 seconds before I shut it off, washing the residue away with a blast of hot water. I breathed a sigh of relief, leaning against the cold marble counter. I was one step closer to taking my empire back. Well, that is certainly an interesting medical regimen. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around my heart, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Standing in the shadows by the walk-in pantry was Terrence. My stepsister's husband was a quiet African-American man who usually faded into the background. Brittany treated him like a subservient accessory, constantly mocking his modest background, while Patricia openly disrespected him. He never fought back, he just watched. And right now, he was watching me. He stepped out of the shadows, the moonlight catching the sharp, unreadable expression on his face. He had seen the entire thing. He knew I was faking my symptoms. He knew I was lucid. Terrence reached into his jacket pocket. He did not say another word. He simply pulled out his cell phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dark kitchen. His thumb hovered over the screen. If he dialed Patricia, my grandfather's plan would be destroyed, and I would be locked in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. I stood paralyzed, watching his thumb press down on the glass. But Terrence did not press the screen. He lowered his phone and locked eyes with me. His gaze was entirely unreadable. He looked down at the floor where a small, chalky fragment of the blue pill had bounced off the sink and landed on the pristine white tile. He stepped forward. I held my breath, my muscles tensed for a fight I was too weak to win. Terrence raised his foot and silently kicked the pill fragment deep under the heavy stainless steel refrigerator, completely out of sight. He slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. Without uttering a single syllable, he turned around and dissolved back into the shadows of the hallway. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Why did he protect me? Why would the man my family constantly humiliated choose to keep my secret? But the sound of a door shutting upstairs snapped me back to reality. I had no time to dwell on his silence. I wiped the sink dry, silently crept back up the grand staircase, and slipped into my bed just before the sun began to rise. The next afternoon, the heavy oak door to my bedroom flew open without a knock. I immediately let my jaw go slack and allowed my eyelids to droop, falling effortlessly back into the performance of a heavily sedated patient. Brittany marched into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She carried a thick stack of legal documents tucked under her arm. Her face was twisted into a smug, predatory smile. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not even look at me like I was a human being. She marched straight to my bedside and slammed the papers onto my lap. "Wake up, Savannah," Brittany snapped, shoving a heavy luxury fountain pen against my chest. "You are going to sign these right now. Mom and I have decided that your real estate liquidation firm is far too much for your fragile little brain to handle. We are restructuring your assets. I am taking over the flagship division immediately." I looked down at the documents. Through my half-closed eyes, I instantly recognized the paperwork. It was a complete corporate transfer agreement for the Pinnacle project, the absolute crown jewel of my company portfolio. It was a massive commercial real estate liquidation deal worth tens of millions of dollars. Brittany wanted to strip the absolute best asset from my company and put it entirely under her own name before the conservatorship hearing even took place. She was too greedy to wait for the judge to hand it to her. I let my hands tremble violently as I reached for the pen. I fumbled it, letting it drop onto the blanket to sell my performance. I let out a confused, pathetic-sounding whimper, staring blankly at the pages. Brittany rolled her eyes, radiating pure disgust. "God, you are completely useless," she muttered. She grabbed my wrist with her manicured fingers and forced the pen back into my shaking hand. "Just sign on the dotted line. I am doing you a favor, Savannah. You belong in a permanent psychiatric care facility, not a boardroom. Sign it so I can go to my spa appointment." I kept my breathing shallow. I let my hands shake erratically as I pressed the pen to the heavy paper. With a sloppy, uncoordinated scrawl, I signed my name at the bottom of the transfer agreement. I did it again on the second page and the third, playing the broken victim flawlessly. The moment the ink dried, Brittany snatched the documents away. She held them to her chest, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. She looked down at me like I was garbage left on the curb. "Enjoy your nap, mental case," she sneered. She turned on her heel and strutted out of the room, closing the door firmly behind her. The moment I heard her footsteps fade down the hallway, the closet door in the corner of my bedroom quietly opened. Grandfather Winston stepped out into the room. He had been standing in the shadows the entire time, listening to every single word. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his face ticked. "Why did you do that?" Savannah Winston demanded, keeping his voice to a harsh, controlled whisper. I was seconds away from stepping out there and ripping those papers out of her greedy hands. "You just surrendered the most valuable asset in your entire portfolio to that entitled brat. Why did you let her take it?" I dropped the trembling act completely. I pushed myself up and sat dead straight against the headboard. I looked at the closed door and a sharp, cold smile spread across my face. "I did not surrender anything." "Grandpa," I whispered back, my voice steady and lethal. "Brittany is an arrogant fool who does not know how to read a balance sheet. She only looked at the projected revenue. She did not bother to run a forensic audit on the holding company attached to those transfer papers." Winston narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to the bed. "What exactly are you saying?" I looked up at him, feeling the power returning to my veins. "The Pinnacle project is a toxic asset. It has a massive hidden $10 million federal tax liability attached to it, along with a pending federal investigation for massive wire fraud committed by the previous developers. I have been trying to figure out how to legally distance my firm from that radioactive disaster for months." I leaned back against the pillows, my smile widening into something truly dangerous. "By forcing my hand and making me sign those papers while under documented medical distress, I am completely absolved of liability. I did not just give Brittany a company. I just handed her a one-way ticket to a federal wire fraud and tax evasion indictment. She did not just steal my business. She just signed her own name onto a federal crime." Winston stared at me in the dim light of my bedroom, the harsh lines of his face softening into something that looked dangerously like pride. He realized in that exact moment that the heavy sedatives had not broken my spirit. I was still the ruthless chief executive he had mentored since I was a child. By tricking my greedy stepsister into signing those corporate transfer documents, I had weaponized my own company. I had handed her a multi-million-dollar federal tax liability, wrapping a wire fraud indictment around her neck like a diamond necklace. We shared a brief, silent nod. The first major piece of Patricia's empire was already rigged to detonate, but we both knew the real war was far from over. The next 3 days were an agonizing test of endurance. I continued my performance, shuffling through the massive hallways of the estate in a heavily medicated haze. I let my jaw hang slack. I drooled slightly when I drank my morning tea, but my mind was running at full capacity, cataloging every single detail of Patricia's routine. I noticed how she guarded her leather briefcase. I tracked the schedules of the private security guards she hired to patrol the grounds. But Patricia was not a fool. She was a master manipulator who had spent her entire career orchestrating medical fraud. She started watching me closely. She would stand in the doorway of the drawing room, her arms crossed, studying the way my hands trembled. She was looking for a crack in my performance, a single moment of clarity in my eyes that would give me away. On Tuesday afternoon, the trap snapped shut. I was sitting in a velvet armchair by the fireplace, pretending to stare blankly at a muted television screen. The heavy oak double doors of the drawing room swung open. Patricia marched inside wearing a pristine white designer suit. Behind her walked a man carrying a black leather medical bag. He had the cold, clinical demeanor of someone who got paid extremely well to keep his mouth shut. "Savannah," Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I brought Dr. Collins to see you. We are going to do a quick wellness check." I let out a low, confused moan, sinking deeper into the armchair. I let my hands shake violently, playing the terrified patient. Dr. Collins stepped forward, unzipping his black bag on the coffee table. He pulled out a tourniquet, a sterile alcohol pad, and a thick syringe. "Just a routine blood draw," Patricia announced, her eyes narrowing as she watched my reaction. "The judge requested an updated toxicology panel ahead of your permanent conservatorship hearing next week. We just need to verify that your medication levels are therapeutic. Roll up your sleeve, darling." My blood ran completely cold. If Dr. Collins drew my blood right now, the lab results would come back entirely clean. The saline Winston had been swapping into my IV bags had flushed the heavy antipsychotics out of my system. The clean blood test would prove to the court that I was not medically dependent. It would prove I was faking my symptoms. Patricia would use that as concrete evidence of manipulative, erratic behavior, giving the judge all the justification needed to lock me in a closed psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. "What the hell is going on in here?" a voice thundered from the doorway. Winston stormed into the drawing room, his cane striking the hardwood floor with lethal authority. He placed himself directly between me and the doctor. "Get that needle away from my granddaughter," Winston growled, glaring at the man. "I am bringing in my own medical team from Johns Hopkins tomorrow. You are not touching her." Patricia did not even flinch. She reached into her tailored jacket and pulled out a folded legal document, slapping it down onto the glass coffee table. "You can call whoever you want." "Winston," Patricia said, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. "But this is a preliminary court order signed by Judge Harmon this morning. It mandates a random, immediate toxicology screening conducted by a court-approved physician." She leaned closer to Winston, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. "Here are your options, old man. If Savannah refuses to take this blood test right now, she is legally deemed non-compliant. The judge will grant me immediate emergency medical power of attorney by default, and I will have her transferred to a secure facility within the hour. If she takes the test, we confirm she is healthy and medicated. Either way, the blood is being drawn today." She had cornered us perfectly. Refuse the test and she wins the conservatorship instantly. Take the test and my clean blood proves I am faking, giving her the ammunition to lock me away. I began to hyperventilate. This time I did not have to fake the panic. My chest heaved and I let out a sharp, choked gasp, wrapping my arms around my stomach. I lurched forward, pretending to dry heave. "She is going to be sick," Winston shouted, playing along instantly. He grabbed my arm, helping me stand. I gagged loudly, pointing toward the attached powder room just a few feet away. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Savannah," Patricia barked, gesturing for Dr. Collins to stand directly outside the bathroom door. "Do not try anything stupid." I stumbled into the small, marble-lined bathroom and slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the brass lock. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dropped to my knees, crawling frantically toward the sink. I knew Winston had kept the original heavily drugged IV bags and the concentrated vials of haloperidol hidden as evidence for our eventual lawsuit. He had taped a small emergency cache to the underside of the vanity sink just in case Patricia ever searched my bedroom. I reached blindly under the marble basin, my fingers brushing against cold tape. I ripped it down. A tiny glass vial of the raw liquid antipsychotic and a sterile syringe fell into my shaking hands. I had to put the drugs back into my system right now to pass her test. But this was raw, undiluted tranquilizer. In the clinic, it was meant to be administered slowly through an intravenous drip over several hours. Injecting it directly into my muscle could trigger a massive cardiac arrest. It was a lethal game of chemical roulette, but I had absolutely no other choice. "Savannah, your time is up," Patricia shouted, her fist pounding aggressively against the bathroom door. "Open this door right now." I uncapped the syringe with my teeth. I drew a microdose of the heavy liquid from the vial, praying I was calculating the volume correctly. I tied my silk hair ribbon tight around my upper arm, forcing a bruised vein to rise to the surface. "I am coming in," Patricia yelled. I drove the needle deep into the bruised, battered tissue of my arm and pushed the plunger down. The icy, burning chemical hit my bloodstream like a freight train, stealing the breath directly from my lungs, right as the heavy brass door splintered open under Patricia's boot. The heavy brass door splintered inward, cracking violently against the marble tile. Patricia stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around the small bathroom. She saw me slumped against the vanity cabinet. The empty syringe was already kicked safely out of sight behind the toilet base. The raw chemical I had just injected directly into my muscle hit me with the force of a freight train. My vision tunneled instantly. A terrifying numbness washed over my limbs and my heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I had taken a desperate gamble with an undiluted antipsychotic, and my body was paying a brutal price. Dr. Collins stepped over the broken door frame, his face an emotionless mask. He knelt beside me, tied the rubber tourniquet tightly around my upper arm, and plunged the needle into my bruised vein. I could barely keep my eyes open. I slurred a completely incoherent sentence, letting my head loll against the cold wall to sell the performance. Patricia watched the dark red blood fill the glass vial, a victorious smile spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She had her concrete proof. Winston pushed past them, his face dark with lethal fury. He scooped me up off the cold tile floor. He carried me back to my bed, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. I barely survived that night. The raw dose of unprescribed medication sent my nervous system into a violent shock, but Winston sat by my side in the dark, monitoring my pulse, until the worst of the chemical storm passed. 2 days later, we sat in a sterile wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Boston. The heavy double doors were closed, sealing us inside for the emergency conservatorship hearing. I wore a sharp navy blue suit, sitting tall beside Winston and his team of elite corporate attorneys. I fought through the lingering brain fog, forcing myself to project the image of a highly competent 33-year-old chief executive. Across the aisle, Patricia sat with her own high-priced legal team. Brittany sat directly behind her mother, typing away on her phone and looking entirely bored. Terrence sat silently next to Brittany, his gaze fixed on the mahogany table in front of him. Patricia's lead attorney stood up and addressed the judge. He confidently presented the results of the mandatory blood test. The toxicology panel was an absolute disaster for our side. It showed massive concentrated levels of heavy sedatives and antipsychotic medications active in my system. The lawyer painted a highly fabricated, tragic picture of a young, successful woman who had suffered a complete psychological collapse. He argued that my brain chemistry was entirely dependent on this heavy psychiatric care, and without Patricia's strict medical oversight, I was in immediate danger to myself and my business empire. Winston's lawyers fought back fiercely. They attempted to introduce years of flawless commercial real estate contracts, detailed bank statements, and character witnesses from my liquidation firm to prove my undeniable competence. They argued that the medical dependency was a recent and highly suspicious development, entirely orchestrated by my stepmother for financial gain. The judge, a stern man with zero patience for wealthy family drama, looked torn. He needed a definitive, unbiased reason to strip a billionaire heiress of her fundamental legal rights. That was when Patricia pulled her trump card. Her attorney called a surprise witness to the stand. I watched in absolute shock as Terrence stood up from the gallery. My heart plummeted into my stomach. Terrence walked slowly to the witness box, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. My mind spun in frantic circles. Why would the man who had secretly protected me in the kitchen just days ago agree to testify for the woman who openly despised him? Terrence kept his eyes downcast, playing the exact role of the subservient, intimidated son-in-law Patricia demanded him to be. Under oath, he told the judge exactly what he had seen. He testified that he woke up for a glass of water at midnight and found me wandering the dark kitchen. He stated clearly for the permanent court record that he watched me act erratically, spit out my prescribed medication, and flush it down the kitchen sink. He painted me as a deeply unstable, deceptive patient who was actively resisting the vital medical care keeping me alive. The courtroom fell dead silent. Winston gripped the armrest of his leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white. I stared at Terrence, feeling a profound, sickening sense of betrayal. He had sold me out to save his own position in the family. Patricia smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph washing over her face. Brittany actually let out a quiet giggle from the gallery. Terrence's testimony was the final nail in my coffin. It provided the exact narrative of non-compliance and severe mental instability the judge needed to make a ruling. The gavel came down with a heavy, hollow thud. The judge granted the temporary conservatorship to Patricia. She now held absolute medical and financial control over my entire life. She could legally lock me away and drain every corporate account I owned. Court was adjourned. It was a devastating, catastrophic defeat. Winston stood up, his face an unreadable mask of cold calculation. He placed a protective hand on my back and guided me out of the courtroom. We stepped into the crowded, echoing hallway of the courthouse. Patricia and Brittany paraded past us, radiating arrogance. Patricia did not even bother to look at me. She was already busy dialing her wealth management team on her cell phone to begin the hostile takeover of my company. Terrence trailed a few steps behind them, carrying Brittany's heavy designer coat over his arm. As he walked past me, the wide courthouse hallway suddenly felt very narrow. Terrence stepped uncharacteristically out of line. He purposefully bumped his shoulder hard against mine. He muttered a quick, generic apology, keeping his head bowed. But in that split second of physical contact, I felt his hand brush against the deep pocket of my wool trench coat. I felt a heavy, dense object slide smoothly into the fabric. I did not gasp. I did not look down. I kept my face entirely blank as I watched him hurry to catch up with my stepsister. When I reached my hand into my pocket, my fingers wrapped around the cold, hard casing of a thick, encrypted burner phone. The ride back to Winston's estate was agonizingly silent. The judge's gavel still echoed in my ears like a death knell. Patricia had won. She held my life, my freedom, and my multi-million-dollar company in the palm of her manicured hands. Beside me in the back seat of the armored SUV, my grandfather Winston stared out the tinted window. His jaw was locked tight enough to crack bone. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, hiding the fact that my right hand was buried deep inside my wool trench coat pocket. My fingers traced the cold, hard edges of the device Terrence had slipped me in the courthouse hallway. As soon as we cleared the massive iron security gates of Winston's compound, I moved. I did not wait for the driver to open my door. I marched straight through the grand foyer and into my grandfather's soundproof study. Winston followed right behind me, slamming the heavy oak doors shut and engaging the brass deadbolt. I pulled the device from my pocket and tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It was not a standard smartphone. It was encased in military-grade rubber, thick and heavy. Winston stopped his furious pacing and stared at it. I pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, bypassing any passcode lock and displaying a stark black interface with a single unlabeled contact. I pressed dial and put the phone on speaker. The line rang exactly once before clicking open. The voice that came through the speaker was not the soft, submissive mumble of the man who had silently endured my family's endless racist remarks for the past 2 years. It was sharp. It was authoritative. It belonged to a man completely in control. "Savannah," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. We do not have much time before Patricia starts executing her asset transfers." Winston leaned over the desk. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Who the hell is this, and why did you just commit perjury to lock my granddaughter in a legal cage? I did what I had to do to protect my operation, Terrence fired back without a shred of intimidation. If I had defended Savannah on that stand, Patricia would have immediately cut my access to the family network. I would have been completely boxed out, and Savannah would still be trapped. My actual employer is the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. I am an undercover federal agent. The air in the study felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I stared at the burner phone in absolute shock. The man Brittany paraded around like a pathetic trophy husband, the man Patricia sneered at and called a broke opportunist, was a highly trained federal operative. He had intentionally married my vain, greedy stepsister. He had swallowed his pride and endured their daily toxicity specifically to get inside the walls of Patricia's empire. Terrence did not pause to let us recover from the shock. He laid out the terrifying reality of my stepmother's business. Patricia is not just a greedy stepmother trying to steal your real estate firm, Savannah Terrence explained, his voice crackling slightly over the encrypted connection. Her elite private wellness clinics are a massive front. She is running one of the largest Medicare fraud and illegal prescription drug distribution syndicates on the East Coast. She is pumping millions of dollars in fraudulent billing through those luxury rehab centers and moving heavy narcotics out the back door. My stomach churned as the pieces rapidly snapped together. The unprescribed antipsychotics she had been pumping into my veins were just a tiny fraction of her illegal stockpile. She had the medical authority, the private facilities, and the untraceable supply lines to do whatever she wanted to whoever she wanted. She was not just a manipulative socialite, she was a ruthless crime boss operating behind a white coat. I have spent 2 years building a federal indictment against her. Terrence continued, the urgency in his voice rising. I have tracked the shell companies. I have the offshore account numbers. But I am missing the smoking gun. Patricia keeps a master ledger. It is a highly encrypted hard drive that contains every single fraudulent transaction, every illegal prescription order, and the names of every corrupt doctor on her payroll. It is the silver bullet that will put her in federal prison for the rest of her natural life. Winston placed his hands flat on the desk, leaning closer to the phone. Then why haven't you raided the place and taken it? Terrence let out a harsh, frustrated breath. Because the hard drive is locked inside a reinforced safe in the basement of her flagship clinic. The safe requires dual biometric access to open. It needs a specific fingerprint and a retinal scan. If I try to force it open with a warrant right now, her internal security protocols will instantly wipe the drive clean before my tactical team can even breach the building. I cannot get in. But you can, Savannah. I stared at the black device on the desk. The sheer gravity of what he was proposing hung heavy in the room. I was legally under Patricia's control as of an hour ago. If I was caught breaking into her clinic, she would not just call the police. She could legally and permanently institutionalize me in a closed ward where no one would ever hear from me again. You want me to break into a highly secured medical facility tonight? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. I need you to, Terrence replied. You are the only person who can bypass her security without triggering a total data wipe. I will provide the hacking interface to override the biometric lock, but you have to physically connect it to the safe. If we do not get that ledger tonight, Patricia will finalize the conservatorship, drain your company accounts, and launder the money through her clinic before the sun comes up. Winston looked at me across the desk. He did not tell me what to do. He waited for the chief executive inside me to make the call. I looked down at my arms, still covered in the fading purple bruises of Patricia's chemical abuse. She had taken my health, my agency, and my dignity. Now she was trying to take my legacy. Send me the blueprints, I said to the phone. I am going in. The heavy silence in my grandfather's study was broken only by the soft hum of the encrypted phone. Terrence did not waste time offering false comfort. He was a federal agent running a highly classified operation, and I had just become his most valuable asset. He transmitted a heavily encrypted file directly to the device he had slipped into my pocket. The screen illuminated with the detailed architectural blueprints of Patricia's flagship wellness clinic. I spread the digital map across Winston's mahogany desk. For the first time in 3 years, my hands were not shaking from fear or heavy sedatives. They were shaking with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Terrence outlined the strategy with military precision. The master ledger containing every piece of evidence of Patricia's Medicare fraud and illegal drug trafficking was stored on an offline server in her basement office. The safe holding the drive was wired directly into the clinic's internal security matrix. If Terrence tried to breach the building with a federal tactical team, Patricia's automated failsafes would instantly wipe the hard drive clean the moment the front doors were forced open. But Patricia had a blind spot. She had registered my biometric data into the clinic's internal system months ago, preparing to transfer me into that exact facility as a permanent lockdown patient once the conservatorship was finalized. Terrence had exploited that blind spot. The hacking interface he provided would piggyback on my existing medical clearance, tricking the server into believing an authorized patient transfer was occurring. It would buy me exactly 4 minutes to extract the hard drive before the system realized it was being robbed. Winston leaned over the blueprints, his sharp eyes calculating the risks. He looked at the phone and told Terrence he could guarantee a 15-minute window of absolute darkness. Winston did not just have money, he had leverage. With a single phone call to a heavily compensated contact at the city's utility management office, Winston orchestrated a localized catastrophic failure of the municipal power grid surrounding the clinic. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the trap was set. I stood in the shadows of the alleyway behind Patricia's elite medical facility. I was dressed in dark practical clothing, a stark contrast to the vulnerable woman who had been weeping in a torn silk gown just hours